In 1910, in a single cafe in Vienna, the men who would build Soviet propaganda, Nazi propaganda, and the psychological architecture of the Holocaust were all sitting within earshot of each other. And one of them was a young, broke, failed art student named Adolf. Today, we're pulling apart the story of Café Central, what it was, who was there, and how a set of psychological theories cooked up over coffee and opium smoke became the intellectual fuel for the worst atrocities of the 20th century. By the end of this episode, you'll understand the chain of causation from one psychologist's ideas to 2 world wars, and why the man most responsible for all of it is someone almost nobody remembers. I've got someone here who has gone deep on this history, and I want to start with a question that I think will reframe everything. Who exactly was at this cafe, and why does it matter
So the first thing you have to do is recalibrate your mental image of what a cafe was in 1910 Vienna. Think of it less like a coffee shop and more like the internet. And if Vienna's cafes were the internet of the day, Café Central was Google. It was adjacent to the University of Vienna, and the leading intellects of the Socialist International had made it their informal hub. If you wanted to know what was going on and who was making it happen, you stopped by Café Central.
So it wasn't just a place to grab a drink, it was where the ideas of the era were actually being formed.
Exactly. And the cast of characters there is almost impossible to believe when you list them all in one place. Among the Jewish intellectuals frequenting the cafe, you had psychologist Alfred Adler, journalist and author Theodor Herzl, poet Peter Altenburg, and psychoanalyst Adolf Joffe. Among the prominent Austrians, you had Sigmund Freud, authors Stefan Zweig and Robert Musil, architect Adolf Loos, librettist Hugo von Hofmannsthal, and Adolf Hitler.
Wait, Hitler was just there? At the same cafe as Freud and Herzl?
Just there. In 1910, Adolf was squandering a small inheritance, pretending to be a student. He wasn't a figure of any significance. He was, as the source puts it, hanging on. And then beyond the Jewish and Austrian circles, you also had Leon Trotsky, still going by his given name, Lev Davidovich Bronstein at the time, Joseph Stalin, Josip Broz Tito, and 2 Serbian nationalists who are absolutely critical to this story, Dimitrije Mitrinović and Vladimir Gaćinović.
That is a genuinely staggering list of people to have in one room, or, well, one cafe.
And here's the thing, they weren't all sitting together. There was an adults' table and a kids' table, so to speak. Alfred Adler and Mitrinović sat at the adults' table. Trotsky and Gaćinović sat at the younger, more volatile end. But don't think for a minute they didn't mingle.
So what was the social dynamic actually like? Because you've got Russian fugitives, Austrian intellectuals, a future dictator or two. How did they all coexist?
Language was a real barrier. The Russians flooding in from the Tsar's repressions were too young and too insular to welcome the older Austrian establishment into their circle. So you had these parallel conversations happening. Hitler, for instance, would have been inclined toward the Austrians because of the language barrier, but he couldn't have missed the pamphlets and papers circulating from Trotsky's table. Trotsky was editing a periodical called The Spark at the time, a paper that would eventually evolve into Pravda, the propaganda instrument of the Soviet Union.
So the literal predecessor to Soviet state propaganda was being written and circulated in this cafe.
Being written, circulated locally as flyers, and sent to every university in Europe in a flurry of envelopes. And here is where it gets really wild. The propaganda arm of both the Soviet Union and the National Socialist Workers' Party trace back to the same source. Not just the same cafe, but the same person, Alfred Adler.
Okay, I have to stop you there because Alfred Adler is not a name most people know. Like, everyone knows Freud, everyone knows Trotsky. Why is Adler the key figure here?
That's exactly the right question, and the answer is partly why he's been forgotten. Adler died of a heart attack in 1933, and the reputations of his students and the monsters who weaponized his work completely eclipsed the man's memory. But ignore his role at your peril, because Adler was the bridging personality of the entire cafe. He was fluent in both Russian and German, he was an established academic with tenure at the University of Vienna, and his intimate professional association with Sigmund Freud meant the 2 cliques, the Russians and the Austrians, were cross-pollinating intellectually.
So he was the connective tissue between all these different factions.
Exactly. And what Adler was developing at the time was a psychological framework that was, in essence, a predictable extension of Karl Marx's sociology into the realm of the mind. Adler saw himself as pioneering what he called an evolutionary theory of psychology. He proposed that beyond the individual psyche, the brain, the mind, the thoughts of a single person, there also existed a psyche that forms in the social ambient, a kind of collective psychology that precipitates from communication and interaction between people.
Like a group mind? That sounds almost science fiction.
It sounds that way, but think about your own life. You have a family clique, a friends clique, a work clique. Each one takes on a character of its own, adopts its own vocabulary, its own humor, its own politics. The longer a clique has been together, the more distinct it becomes. Adler was formalizing that observation into a psychological theory. And he went further. He proposed that in large social ambients, like a crowd at a stadium, individual psyches begin to cohere into an aggregate. The emotional intensity of the event draws people together psychologically.
Oh, that's actually really intuitive. Like how a crowd at a concert or a sports game starts moving and feeling as one unit.
Right. And Adler was suggesting that this was not just an observation, it was something that could theoretically be animated and directed. That you could, under the right conditions, motivate a crowd to act in concert and with specificity. Now, Adler himself was thinking about this as a professor, as an academic exploring theoretical potential. But Leon Trotsky was not planning to lead a soccer stadium in a human wave. Trotsky was planning to incite a worldwide revolution.
So Trotsky heard Adler's theory and immediately saw it as a blueprint.
Immediately. Because according to Marx, the proletariat had to form a clique, a distinct class consciousness, before they could achieve their revolutionary goals. And Adler was offering not just an interesting theory, but a determinative psychology, a procedure by which you could organize and cultivate class consciousness. Trotsky's pamphlet, The Spark, was already the primary instrument through which Russian socialists were trying to do exactly that. Adler essentially showed Trotsky how to make it work.
And Adler had no idea what Trotsky was going to do with it.
The argument is that Adler was to Trotsky what Professor Slughorn was to Tom Riddle in Harry Potter. He was collecting a promising young mind. Trotsky was a stateless fugitive from the Tsar's justice, and Adler likely saw him as just another eager student, a willing ear with whom he could explore theoretical potential without the risk of plagiarism or professional rivalry. Brainstorming with colleagues was fraught with risk. With a castaway like Trotsky, Adler could filibuster for hours without inhibition.
That's such a chilling image. The brilliant professor just talking freely, not realizing he's handing a weapon to someone who will use it.
And the specific weapon was this. Adler taught Trotsky how to manipulate two contending forces in the human psyche, the inferiority complex and the superiority complex. Adler proposed that every human being has these two contending voices within, one that appraises the self as inferior and one that revolts against that inferiority. In well-adjusted individuals, the disparity between the two is fractional. But Adler also predicted that a social psyche could become unstable, that a group could exhibit the same kind of psychological imbalance as a disturbed individual.
And that's the lever. You target the inferiority complex of a group, and then you offer them the superiority complex as the solution.
That is precisely the architecture of both Soviet and Nazi propaganda. In both systems, narratives of collective victimization repeatedly targeted the inferiority complex of the audience. And in both systems, promises of revolutionary greatness appealed to the superiority complex. The frameworks are so uniform that one wonders why the two movements ever conflicted at all. And the answer, darkly, may trace back to those long nights in the cafe, the young Adolf a few tables away from Trotsky, absorbing what little Russian he understood, the words for inferior and superior drifting across the room.
So Hitler was essentially building his own version of the same playbook, but aimed at a different enemy.
That's the argument. And it's worth noting what Hitler was absorbing from the Austrian side of the cafe as well. Later biographers confirm it was in Vienna where Adolf acquired and refined an intense, almost obsessive interest in architecture and opera. Men like Adolf Loos and Hugo von Hofmannsthal, both fixtures at Café Central, were likely influences, if not exemplars, for the young Hitler. He was listening to the Austrians and reading what the Russians put in ink.
Okay, so now I want to get to the part that connects all of this to actual historical events. Because we've established who was there and what ideas were circulating. But how does a cafe conversation lead to World War I?
This is where Mitrinović and Gaćinović become absolutely essential. I mentioned them earlier, both Serbian nationalists, both members of the Young Bosnia movement. Mitrinović was a close intellectual associate of Adler's, close enough that Adler eventually entrusted him with founding the English branch of the Adler Society, a clique within the International Society for Individual Psychology. So there is no question that Adler's ideas flowed directly to Mitrinović.
And Gaćinović was Mitrinović's associate.
Gaćinović was to Mitrinović what Trotsky was to Adler, the younger, more volatile figure absorbing the ideas and taking them somewhere the mentor never intended. And what Gaćinović did with those ideas was this. He recruited and armed the assassins who murdered Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, the Duchess of Hohenberg, in 1914.
Wait, the assassination that started World War I traces back to conversations at Café Central?
Directly, and not accidentally. The assassinations were designed with the specific intent of triggering a war between Europe's leading monarchies. Adlerian psychology predicted the outrage that would follow, the emotional intensity in the social ambient that would draw individual psyches into an aggregate and motivate them to act. The assassination was, in a horrifying sense, a calculated application of the theory. Strike the right emotional nerve at the right moment, and the crowd moves.
That is genuinely one of the most disturbing things I've heard. They were essentially running a psychological experiment on all of Europe.
And it worked. The chain runs from Adler to Mitrinović, from Trotsky to Gaćinović, and from Gaćinović to the gunmen in Sarajevo. There is no doubt, according to this analysis, that Adler's after-hours instruction at Café Central led directly to the assassinations that started World War I. And Adler's subsequent reaction suggests he was oblivious to the intent. He found himself under intense scrutiny after the Archduke's assassination, broke all ties with his associates in Vienna, emigrated to the United States, and took up a research position in New York.
So he ran.
He left. Whether that was guilt, fear, or simply the rational response of a man who suddenly understood what his ideas had been used for, that's debated. What happened next is even stranger. In 1933, Adler was attending a psychology conference at a university in Aberdeen, Scotland, when he suffered a heart attack and died on the spot. Scottish authorities knew only that he was Jewish and determined his remains had to be interred according to Jewish custom. His remains were cremated immediately, and then the urn was promptly misplaced.
Misplaced. The urn of one of the most consequential psychologists in history was just lost.
Lost. And that has fueled more than one conspiracy theory, particularly among New York's Jewish community. Some have speculated that Adler was recruited by and disappeared by British intelligence, owing to his intimate knowledge of both Trotsky and Hitler. The argument being that of all the people in the world, Adler would have been uniquely valuable in defending the Allied West against the propaganda machines of the Soviet Union and the emerging Third Reich.
That's a wild theory. Do you buy it?
The counter-argument is that the sheer incompetency of British intelligence leading up to World War II makes it hard to believe they were running that kind of sophisticated operation. It's more likely the urn was genuinely lost in bureaucratic chaos. But the conspiracy theory persists because the stakes were so high. This was a man who knew where all the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking.
And speaking of where the bodies were buried, there's something almost darkly funny about the fact that the Austrian foreign minister actually knew Trotsky by name. Like, the authorities were aware of what was happening at this cafe.
This is one of the most striking moments in the whole story. Just before the assassination of the Archduke, Austria's imperial foreign minister, Count Berchtold, was openly antagonized by a man named Victor Adler, unrelated to Alfred, as far as anyone knows, who insisted that open war in Europe would provoke a revolution in Russia. And the Count famously responded, "And who will lead this revolution? Perhaps Mr. Braunstein sitting over there at the Café Central?"
He said that sarcastically.
Completely dismissively. And that dismissiveness, that inability to take a clique of café intellectuals seriously, may have been one of history's most catastrophic miscalculations. The Count's familiarity with Mr. Braunstein tells us that the Archduke's agents were aware of the threat. They just didn't believe it was real. Who could plausibly take a group of opium-smoking, coffee-sipping chin-scratchers seriously? These men were convinced they had evolved into a superior species of intellect. The more prolific mouths among them never left the café.
And yet, those were exactly the people who set the 20th century on fire.
Exactly. And I want to come back to the opium point for a second, because it's not a footnote, it's actually part of the context. Opium and morphine circulated openly and legally among accredited academia in this period. They were smuggled into Europe only to avoid import tariffs and red tape, not because they were illegal. And Joseph Stalin, it has been presumed, found his entrance in Vienna while smuggling opium from Persia, through his homeland in the Caucasus, and up the Danube.
So Stalin may have literally been the drug dealer of the café intellectual scene.
That's the implication. And when you layer that on top of everything else, the psychological theories, the revolutionary planning, the narcissistic intellectual culture, you start to understand how a group of people could convince themselves that engineering a global war of extinction was not just justified, but scientifically inevitable.
That phrase, global war of extinction, is not hyperbole, right? That was actually the stated objective.
It was the stated objective of both Soviet socialism and National Socialism. The revolution to come, as it was agreed at Café Central, had to be sudden, violent, and catalytic. In the planned conflagration, the world's royalty, nobility, aristocracy, and bourgeoisie would be eliminated in one fell swoop. Their plan was, in their own estimation, extremely scientific. And on the periphery of that coffee klatch was a loner named Adolf, soaking it all in from a table across the room, making plans of his own.
And the propaganda machines that both movements built were, as you said, running on the same psychological engine.
The same levers. In both Soviet and Nazi propaganda, narratives of collective victimization targeted the inferiority complex of the audience. In both designs, promises appealed to the superiority complex. Alfred Adler's concept of the social psyche was the fulcrum on which both propaganda systems operated. The frameworks are so uniform that historians have genuinely puzzled over why the two movements ever came into conflict at all.
And the answer you offered earlier is that Hitler absorbed a distorted version of the same ideas, filtered through language barriers and, let's be honest, probably some narcotic haze.
The Russian words for inferior and superior, nishi and prevoskhodiyashi, lingered too long in Adolf's mind, as the source puts it. He built his own version of the playbook, aimed at a different enemy with a different in-group, but the psychological architecture was the same. Target the wound, promise the cure, animate the crowd.
I want to zoom out for a second because there's a broader argument here that I find really compelling. This idea that the Holocaust wasn't just the product of one furious, goose-stepping Nazi, but of a systemic failure within accredited academia. Can you walk me through that?
Yes, and this is the part that I think has the most relevance beyond the history. The argument is that every time academia crosses an epiphanic threshold, every time we gain paradigm-shifting knowledge, dissonance among the intelligentsia results in social upheaval and human rights violations. And with each new epiphany, the severity of the resulting upheaval is amplified. The Holocaust was not an aberration. It was the culmination of a pattern.
A pattern that goes back further than 1910.
Much further. The argument traces it all the way back to the invention of the optical lens by Ibn Sahl, and then through Galileo's telescope, Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope, Malthus, Darwin, Pasteur, each discovery opening a new rabbit hole, each one generating a wave of pseudo-scientific thinking that outpaced the genuine science. By the time the founders of the 20th century's socialist movement met at Café Central, the march toward the Holocaust was, in this framing, nearly complete. All that was needed was a spark.
And the spark was literally the name of Trotsky's pamphlet.
Which became Pravda, which became the propaganda instrument of the Soviet Union. The naming is almost too on the nose. And the diagnosis for why this keeps happening, why academia keeps producing these catastrophic failures, is a consistent failure to maintain the integrity of peer review. Hypothesis gets presented to the general public as settled science instead of mere hypothesis. And when people define themselves by what they believe, they become incapable of abandoning those beliefs even when the evidence demands it.
That's a really uncomfortable mirror to hold up because that's not just a 1910 problem.
It's not. The argument is that what every major religion instructs and what peer review of science enforces is that we are our own worst counsel. Accepting that is the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual. When theologians are more devoted to their interpretations of Scripture than to manifest truth, that is a form of idolatry. When scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth, that is also a form of idolatry. And the men at Café Central were, in that sense, idolaters of the highest order.
They worshipped their own ideas.
And convinced themselves those ideas were science. The proletariat, as the source puts it, was the first and only species of hominid in history to be defined by science. Except it wasn't science. It was insanity dressed in academic language, circulated in pamphlets, and amplified by the psychological techniques of a professor who never intended any of it.
So when you step back from all of this, from the cafe, the psychologist, the pamphlets, the assassins, the propaganda machines, what's the through line that connects it all?
The through line is that ideas have consequences that their originators cannot foresee or control. Alfred Adler developed a genuine, sophisticated theory of social psychology. He shared it openly, as academics do, with the people around him. And those people, Trotsky, Mitrinović, Gaćinović, and eventually Hitler, took those ideas and built weapons out of them. The inferiority complex and the superiority complex became the levers of mass mobilization. The social psyche became the target of industrial-scale manipulation.
And the people who should have been watching, the Austrian security services, the count who joked about Trotsky at the cafe, they were aware but dismissive.
Aware and dismissive. That combination is lethal. The Count's sarcastic remark about Mr. Bronstein sitting at the Café Central is one of history's great examples of catastrophic underestimation. The threat was visible, the players were known, and the response was a joke.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. We tend to tell the story of the Holocaust and the World Wars as stories about monsters, about Hitler, about Stalin, about ideological evil, and those things are real. But this framing suggests that the more uncomfortable story is about a cafe, a professor, and the way brilliant ideas get weaponized by people the professor never took seriously enough to worry about.
That's exactly it. And it's uncomfortable because it implicates not just the monsters, but the institutions, the universities, the academic culture, the peer review failures that allowed pseudoscience to masquerade as truth. The Holocaust should not be attributed solely to a furious, goose-stepping Nazi. It should also be attributed to a fatal flaw within accredited academia that has produced great injustices throughout history, and that flaw has not been fixed.
That's the part that really lands. Because we can look at 1910 Vienna and say, well, that was a different time, different circumstances. But the failure mode, brilliant people sharing powerful ideas without accountability for how those ideas get used, that's not historical.
It's not historical at all. The pattern repeats. Every epiphanic threshold in human knowledge creates a window where the ideas outpace the wisdom to use them responsibly. And in that window, the people most willing to weaponize the ideas, not the most careful, not the most ethical, but the most ambitious and the most ruthless, move fastest.
And what's the practical takeaway from that? Like, what do you do with this?
You take peer review seriously. You demand that hypothesis be labeled as hypothesis, not science. You pay attention to who is absorbing powerful ideas and what they're planning to do with them. And maybe most importantly, you don't dismiss the people at the corner table just because they look like cafe intellectuals. The Count thought Trotsky was a blowhard. History had other plans.
That is a line I'm going to be thinking about for a while. Don't dismiss the people at the corner table.
Because sometimes the person at the corner table is writing the spark that lights the world on fire. And sometimes the person 2 tables over is taking notes.
We started this episode with the image of a single cafe in Vienna where the architects of Soviet propaganda, Nazi propaganda, and the psychological blueprint for the Holocaust were all sitting within earshot of each other. And what we've traced today is how that wasn't a coincidence, it was a convergence. A psychologist's genuine theory, a revolutionary's ruthless ambition, a nationalist's violent plan, and a failed artist's resentful eavesdropping all colliding in one room over coffee and opium smoke, and producing the 20th century's worst catastrophes.
And the man most responsible for the intellectual framework, Alfred Adler, is the one almost nobody remembers. His urn is literally lost somewhere in Scotland, while the monsters he inadvertently equipped are the ones history can't stop talking about.
Which is its own kind of tragedy, and its own kind of warning. The next time someone tells you that ideas are just ideas, that what gets discussed in academic circles or circulated in pamphlets or posted online doesn't have real-world consequences, remember Café Central. Remember that the spark Trotsky was writing in that cafe became Pravda. Remember that the psychological levers Adler described over coffee became the engine of 2 of history's most devastating propaganda machines. And remember the Count who laughed at the thought of Mr. Bronstein leading a revolution. He wasn't laughing for long.